So before I introduce the speakers, just a bit of framing for the conversation, which I don't think could be more timely. All around the world, of course, we see the world in turmoil with conflict from Ukraine to Middle East to Sudan, not to mention the conflicts we don't really speak about that much, such as the DRC or intractable conflicts. In addition to that, we still have 1 in 10 people around the world living in extreme poverty, despite the promise of the world, well, in 2015 when we agreed the Sustainable Development Goals, but before that with the Millennium Development Goals to end extreme poverty for good. And of course, against that backdrop, we have seen many countries retreating from international development, notably with the US. Cutting USAID altogether, and of course, regrettably, the UK also cutting their international aid budgets. So we really have to maximise every penny that we do have left. We have to ensure it's focused on the right things, and we also have to look at how we leverage other forms of financing and other levers, whether it's trade, for example. And working with the European Union has to be a vital part of that. The EU and its members are the world's largest foreign aid donor, 44% of the world's total. And of course, before we left the European Union, we did a lot of work on international development through the EU and with the EU. And we have seen a very welcome reset from Labour on the Labour government on EU relations, but so far international aid has not focused very heavily in those discussions. But recently we have seen an agreement to establish a regular dialogue in the area of development cooperation, particularly with a focus on international disaster and humanitarian response, which is a step forward. So it's a really important discussion. I know, we're spending a lot on defence, which is really important, but I really see defence and development as two sides of the same coin when it comes to not only our national security, but our role in the world. And of course, our development is very important as a soft power tool as well. So for this discussion, I'm going to hand over to each of the speakers, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. If you want to ask a question, please do use the chat function if you can. You can I can call you, or if you want to put it in the chat, I could also read out questions if you prefer. So I'm very pleased to have as our speakers Anneliese Dodds MP, Labour MP for Oxford East. I know many of you will know her in many roles, and of course most relevant to this discussion, formerly Minister of State for Development at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And we're very pleased also to be joined by Harlem Désir, member of the Advisory Board for the International Rescue Committee, a brilliant humanitarian organisation, formerly leader of the French Socialist Party and Minister for European Affairs. So I'm going to hand over first to Anneliese and then Harlem to give us some remarks on the subject of today's discussion. So Anneliese, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alice, and it's such a pleasure to be part of this event with you. It's been really brilliant to work with you, of course, in Parliament, and you bring so much expertise on these issues into Parliament as a Labour MP, and a real privilege to be on the same kind of virtual platform as Harlem, whose work I've followed for a long time, and of course, starting off in such a powerful anti-racist movement right into then government at the highest level, and of course the Parti Socialiste in France. So wonderful to be part of this conversation and with all of you, of course, as members of LME as well. And I completely agree with what Alice said at the beginning. Now really is an important time to be talking about these issues. Alice set out many of the reasons why this is a particularly important conversation. I suppose I would also add that we have a number of milestones that are taking place at the moment. We've just had the Financing for Development conference taking place in Seville, and it was actually very positive. I think that countries did agree broadly on what they wanted to see in the future around development, with the exception of US. The US didn't participate because it didn't agree with, unfortunately, sustainable development being mentioned in the final communique, but other countries did agree, and that was very positive. We have the UN's General Assembly coming up in the autumn, and then, of course, COP in Brazil as well. So other reasons why I think it's important for us to talk about this, particularly within the Labour Party and with friends from progressive parties and from the centre left, is because I think it's fair to say that while we've seen a critique of aid and development from the right, we have also seen one from the left. I kind of would really sum this up as the debate that we saw between Bob Geldof and Ed Sheeran. If anyone followed that, obviously Ed Sheeran saying, look, we need to be moving beyond the kind of model of development that existed, for example, back at the times of Band-Aid. My own view is, I think, yes, we need to have development that is self-critical, that is reflective, that actually rejects any kind of paternalism that might have existed in the past. But in doing that, we cannot throw out the incredibly important work that is needed. And that's at a time, as Alice said, when we have, more conflicts than at any point since 1948, when we see also huge amounts of humanitarian needs, the biggest absolute amounts actually ever. And I think it's also happening at a time when arguably there's very little public knowledge about those big humanitarian crises. Alice talked about, obviously, the situation in the Middle East, in Gaza, and in Ukraine. But very few people, I think, in the UK would be aware of what's taking place necessarily in Sudan, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Again, probably very few people are aware that actually, even if you go by the UN's new measure for humanitarian needs, which they've called hyper prioritizing, only a fifth of that is actually funded by donors. So the need is far greater than the availability of aid at the moment. And that's why we've got to work with our friends. So I really am convinced that the UK does have to work with the EU. I was very pleased to see what Alice just mentioned, the fact that coming out of that May summit between the UK and the EU, we did see a positive commitment to a dialogue on development and on humanitarian action, and also to working together, particularly on humanitarian issues. I think it's good that the agreement covers both. That's, of course, reflecting how the EU itself is organised when it comes to development. Clearly, in the UK, we put both issues together, development and the humanitarian and disaster response side. They're more separated in terms of personnel at EU level. But the fact we're going to be talking about both, I think, is really important. So in the rest of my remarks, I really just want to talk about some areas where I think we will need to work together in the future, and areas that I hope that dialogue will cover. First of all, I think we need to coordinate, first of all, when it comes to geographical coverage. There's been some really helpful work undertaken by the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and they've shown how there's a small number of countries which will be disproportionately impacted through reductions in aid when it comes actually to their gross national income. Countries like Somalia, for example, where when you look at the reduction in aid, that's going to have a very significant impact on their economy overall. And in those circumstances, it's important that donors do coordinate, that they really think about how to ensure that there aren't huge cliff edges for different countries. Of course, the nations with which we've had strong bilateral donor relationships, as the UK, are often those with which we have an existing relationship. Labour governments have tried to make that a more neutral process. They've tried to base it more on need, particularly on the number of people in extreme poverty in different countries. But there has always been an overlay of UK relationship with different countries, countries with whom we've had a long-term relationship, like Malawi, for example. It's been the same in nations like France too. And in those circumstances, as I said, I think it's really important that we do try and coordinate when it comes to geography. I think we also need to coordinate when it comes to the activity of multilateral organisations. And here, I think we have to recognise that the current architecture is not going to remain the same into the future. Now, in my view, reform was needed. I think particularly when you look at an area like climate finance, where there's a huge proliferation of different funds, often the response to a problem being to set up a new fund rather than to think about what low-income countries need, we can't really continue with a system that's so fragmented, that is so difficult for low-income countries to navigate, let alone fragile countries or countries experiencing conflict. So we need to see reform there. We need to see reform also when it comes to the humanitarian architecture. I know that's something that the IRC has been looking at. I'm sure Harlem's been considering this in detail too. And we also need to look at areas where you have incredible organisations which probably can do more to work together around their back office functions. I know, for example, that the World Health Organization is seeking to work much more with, for example, UNAIDS, with the UNFPA, the Family Planning Organization, with the Global Fund against AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria as well. So those kinds of really needs for coordination should be ones that both the UK and EU can push for, and obviously do so from the point of view of always seeking the most democratic outcome and effective outcome possible. I think finally, we also do need to ensure that we're working together beyond aid, and Alice talked about this. It really is critical that we focus on those issues that countries in the global south have said in terms of their representatives time and time again to me that they're frustrated about. There's a huge discussion going on at the moment about global taxation. I think it's really important that the UK and countries in the EU engage with that they understand where countries in the global south are coming from on that. Too often, the global tax system has not actually supported growth in low-income countries. We need to make sure that we're also driving down debt. We're right back to those bad, bad old days of the time of the Jubilee campaigns in terms of the level of debt. It's a new type of debt now. A lot of it's held by China, a lot of it's held by the private sector or by regional banks, but we should be working together, including with the EU and UK, to really push a strong reform agenda when it comes to debt as well. We need to promote the voice of global south countries in international institutions. I think it's really positive the African Union now has a seat on the G20. We need to be seeking to do more when it comes to other organisations. Now, this is a difficult political challenge, of course, when it comes to the World Bank, where, arguably other countries like China would be saying, well, hang on, what about us? But I think we have to together really focus on those issues about voice. We need to promote the kind of innovation that's going to be important as well. For example, when it comes to disaster related insurance, when it comes to far more accessible finance as well. We've seen the Capital Markets Union, huge initiative within the EU, a lot of activity in the UK too around this. Well, how can that then make sure that access to financing is open to countries in the global south? We have to promote integration of economies. And here, of course, the EU has a huge amount to say. Sadly, across the continent of Africa in particular, very often now trade is harder than it was in previous decades. That's because we've seen increasing barriers, logistical barriers, barriers because of geopolitical challenges. How can we work together so that potential of trade is unleashed, and so that countries like the UK and those in the EU are not worsening the situation for global south countries through our approach to trade? And finally, how can we make sure that our agenda on the technologies of the future, again, is supporting development and growth rather than militating against it? When it comes to AI, for example, so often, actually, the research that could be brought into the hands of so many people in the poorest countries, that research is locked away because of problems around access to academic information, to technical information, in Global South countries. Well, how can we work together to open up access to those sources of potential future growth? There's a huge amount I think we can do together. I really think the time to be increasing that coordination is now. But just finally, Alice, before I finish, I think we also need to ensure that we're working more broadly with other countries beyond the UK and EU on these questions. When I was in my role as minister, we sought to work a lot with Brazil, particularly on issues relating to global hunger. Where can we work with third countries as well, where they have that strong commitment? We've seen Gulf countries, for example, becoming more active, some of them more active a few years ago and then less, and now some of them increasing activity again. How can we have that stronger relationship so that we can face up to these challenges, which ultimately impact on us all: global poverty, instability, insecurity, and of course the climate crisis? Thank you so much again for having me, and I was really trying to speak as loudly as possible there, so I hope that people could hear me online. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Anneliese, and it's been great to have you with such a powerful voice, and of course the principled stance that you took earlier in the year, and to still be working so hard on all these issues. Harlem, I will hand over to you to add your thoughts to this important discussion.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to join this conversation with the Labour Movement for Europe. And I want to say how happy I am to have this discussion with Anneliese and the other member. And I know the work Anneliese has been doing as a member of government, as well as a member of parliament, working very closely with my former colleagues of the IRC. I was SVP of Senior Vice President of this organization for more than 3 years, and now only an advisor, but we very much appreciated our thought and our leadership. So I agree completely with what Anneliese just said. I mean, the combination of aid cuts and increased needs and so many crises well beyond what is just doing the headlines in the news is creating dramatic consequences for millions of people, but it also obliged the other donors than the US, especially the EU and the UK, but not only them, to work better together, but also to think differently and to dare to think also about changing the system, because we need to innovate. We need also to convince the people that it's worth it to invest in international assistance, in development aid, in humanitarian assistance. And we need to demonstrate that we can make a difference. Of course, it doesn't mean that we can do better with less. We have to do better with the same amount, maybe. We have to find new resources, and you mentioned innovative finance, new way of taxation, for example, based on those sectors who are benefiting from globalization, like the transport or some part of the finance industry. But fundamentally, we have also to really clearly say that we will not follow the line of the US in terms of budget cuts. First, because it is inhuman and insane. Second, because it is very bad policy when you look at the consequences of aggravation of instability, of conflict, potentially of migration. And third, because it's stupid in terms of soft power, of influence, especially in some continents like Africa, where other very strong power like China are willing to take the place of the Western potential partners of these new emerging economies and countries. So it means that the UK and the EU together should be also very strong in saying that they will not put in the balance what we know are new necessity in terms of defense spending. For example, we know that the budget contexts are very tight in all of our country, with on the other side another part very important of international policy, which is development and humanitarian assistance. And let's just think about the figures. When we are cutting 0.3% of GDP in international assistance, it can mean a lot. It can mean half of it or a third of it, while it will not help at all our states to reach their 5% of GDP in defense. So it doesn't make a big difference in terms of the budget for security, but it will make a very huge difference in terms of the million of people who will not be able to benefit from our support. I agree, but that also budget is not the only question here, and that we have to innovate very much in terms of our way of working and in many fields. So I will not go back on all of the fields that Anneliese mentioned, but I will just mention a few others or little bit different approaches. First, on the geography, and let me put a mic here, maybe. I don't know if you can hear me better now. Yes. We should also look at the concentration of crises. I mean, we know that it's easier for the World Bank, for example, and for a lot of the development agencies to work with states and to work with developing emerging economies and with the poor states. And even in the developing economy, you have some parts of concerned states, like the north of Nigeria, for example, which are not very easy to reach for international community or for the state. So we must be careful of the fact that a very great part of what we consider as development assistance is not going to the part of the world population which is the more affected by crisis. And in fact, there is concentration. IRC tries to show this in an annual report at the end of each year, looking at the trends for the next year. There is, like in 20 countries, 80% of the needs in terms of needs for nutrition, needs for vaccination, needs for education, which are concentrated. While these 20 countries or so are roughly receiving 25% of international assistance, and they should rather receive half of it than this very low part. And for climate finance, it's even very less than this, because it's very difficult, of course, to have the states and to have companies to invest in this more fragile context, which are the one where the combination of conflict, of climate crisis, put more people at risk. So we should look at also the geography of the needs. And I think the UK and the EU has a very good experience of this, the FCDO and ECHO, for example, to work together on this. Second, and it's a little bit for the same reason, it's very important to continue to invest more in working with civil society organizations, both local NGOs and international NGOs, which have the capacity to reach the more fragile communities, those populations which are sometimes out of reach of their own states because of conflict. For example, you mentioned Somalia. That's a good example of this, like many other places in the Horn of Africa. And then there are also fields in which I think by acting together, by leveraging our capacity, by also encouraging innovation, we should demonstrate and convince the people that we can have a very more transformative actions than we have nowadays. I will mention maybe 3 or 4 of this field. The first is malnutrition. At any given time, there are more than 45 million children under 5 which are confronted and experiencing the worst forms of malnutrition. And there is no thing inevitable in this. We have at the IRC, together with some other agencies, contribute to develop a simplified protocol of treating children with malnutrition, so that they can be treated whatever the form of malnutrition they are confronted to in one clinic with one therapeutic food product, and it avoids the complexity of the current traditional treatment, and it can allow, with the same amount of money, to reach much more people, to form community people, to do this work, and to have very important results. And I think it will worth it for the UK and the EU to have an objective of eradication of malnutrition within the next 5 years, and to invest together in the places where we can really get this result. Second is vaccination. We are working together with Gavi, which is a global alliance for vaccination, to ensure that children which are in out-of-reach places can have access to vaccination. This is the most effective public health tool ever developed. And without vaccination, as you know, children are confronted to deadly disease like measles or polio. And of course, again, it's difficult sometimes to reach some part of the population, especially the displaced population, those who are in very conflicted places. But it is possible to do it, and we have demonstrated this with this program, which is called REACH, with which we have administered a vaccine to over 12 million children, especially in the Horn of Africa, but also in Chad and Nigeria in the past 2 years. And I think here too, UK and EU could work together. The third is in climate change, and especially in the fragile context where it had to the usual consequences in terms of food insecurity, of risk for farms, for community infrastructure. And here it's true that we need to use more of new technology. We have developed, for example, an anticipatory action program together with Google and with the support of the EU. I'm sure with the UK we could even do more to ensure that before extreme event, the local community can be supported with cash distribution so that they can cope with the risk before the disaster, the floods or the drought has reached them and has destroyed their livestock and so on. And the fourth domain is, I think, the support to women's-led organization, because that's really a very important way of ensuring protection first, but also empowerment of local communities, equity in access to resources, a contribution to peace building and to education program. And I think that if we could, in these very few domains, make a demonstration that working together, the UK and the EU are responding to not only the withdrawal of USAID, but also to the needs, and that it's worth it to support that kind of programs. We could also encourage more private financing, more other partners. You mentioned the Gulf states, Brazil, a lot of others, I think will be ready to and encouraged to join if we have developed a leadership in that kind of field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harlem. I think between you, you've both covered a huge amount of ground, which is very welcome. I can see some questions in the chat, which I'll read out now, and I'll come to a few people in the audience as well. I'll probably take 3 together and then come back to you. So, John Browning, why don't you say your question, and then I'll pick 2 from the chat.
Question 1 is, FCDO does a lot of delivery using consultancies to do spend donor money. Is there a way that we could make sure we do that more with some of the development professionals within FCDO and build their capacity to work in the field, which has been lost, and not just rely on big consultancy companies who are often for profit, even though they do deliver good work? Second question, in a very difficult and insecure world with multiple conflicts, we seem to be forgetting about the necessity of soft power. So how do we keep in people's minds, public and government, the need for soft power as an equal and constructive part of security itself, not just international development? Thanks.
Very much, John, and excellent behaviour with questions, being very short and questions. I'll take the first 2 in the chat. So from Sarah, can the Labour government be persuaded to increase its foreign aid spending, and have Labour in the UK copied the Trump regime by cutting spend on foreign aid, and if so, why? And the second one specifically on the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, obviously suffered one of the worst humanitarian disasters ever seen since the Second World War. What steps can the UK with the EU take to increase humanitarian aid to the DRC, especially in the wake of the US-mediated peace deal signed between the DRC and Rwanda? Anneliese, shall I come to you first? You probably might want to pick up on that second question and the one about consultants as well, and then I'll come to Harlem, but address other ones if you'd like as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. First of all, on the DRC, I mean, I was obviously extremely relieved to see that peace deal. I think I probably wasn't the only person to be a little bit surprised that we had seen US focus on that area, but obviously very good that there had been a peace deal between DRC and Rwanda. Probably a lot of people on this call will be aware of the humanitarian situation there, but more generally, there hasn't been a lot of coverage of this in the UK press. There's been an ongoing and increasingly complicated and bloody conflict there, some really atrocious human rights abuses and very, very extensive impact on people, lots of food insecurity, and of course we also saw mpox outbreak as well. Now the UK was engaged in particularly support related to the latter, so really trying to work with local healthcare workers and scientists in DRC in relation to mpox. I think it is important that both the UK and EU now seek to do what we can to try and support that peace that has been brokered, which is, I think, quite fragile, but try and support it and move the country and its people in a far better direction. On the other question about kind of relating to the US, I genuinely, although I disagreed with the decision to take all the funding for additional defence spend from international development, I do genuinely believe the Prime Minister was sincere when he said that this was not an ideological decision. It was a decision that was taken with regret. We have seen some other countries cutting aid as an ideological decision beyond the US. We've seen that kind of motivation in the Netherlands, arguably in Sweden as well, from right-wing governments. But that has not been the case with countries like the UK. Arguably wasn't either, I would say, for Germany, for France. This was related to fiscal pressures. So do I think that we will see an increase in spending? Obviously, I hope that there will be. There is still a legal commitment, of course, to 0.7 as fiscal circumstances allow. So I think really the key thing for the future is going to be demonstrating that value of aid, as Harlem was talking about, showing what we can deliver, and then also actually showcasing what Brits are able to achieve, and indeed Europeans, when they are engaged in some of these conflict areas and areas of humanitarian need. I'm really proud of what people from my country are able to do all around the world, whether that's in technical assistance, mine clearance, as I saw when I visited a Scottish NGO that was focused on that, whether it's in healthcare, as I was just talking about, so many other areas that I think we really need to make sure are communicated to the UK public, because I think they're very proud of it when they learn about that contribution. And then, sorry, I'll speed up, Alice, on consultancies. I think John makes a really good point, actually. I think we saw a significant rise in the use of consultancies within the UK and the government aid effort when there was the first significant cut to aid. And obviously consultancies are viewed as being more flexible than a government department employing people directly. They can also be viewed as a way of reducing risk. My personal view is, however, when you have too many layers, it can get more expensive than it needs to be. And on top of that, you can have less control over eventual delivery. but you still have to deal with the reputational risk, because ultimately, if we're talking about taxpayers' money, it doesn't matter if it's routed through PwC or something like that before it goes to an end recipient. I believe that government should still be responsible for that when it goes right, and also if it goes wrong. So I don't think that using consultancies outsources risk. On soft power, I'm not going to provide the best description of the importance of soft power. I think General Dannett has done that actually in his article immediately after the aid cut, when he said, look, he's run the UK's army. He understands what the link is between defence, diplomacy and development. And I genuinely could not have put it better than he did. I think you make a really important point there, John.
Thank you, Anneliese. Harlem, do you want to add anything to any of those questions, maybe DRC and the soft power one?
Well, first, yes, this soft power issue is very important, and it was a relief to see that the peace deal was broken for DRC and Rwanda, but also a surprise to see that the US administration, even if it seems to have not a great amount of interest for Africa, was able to do this, while European, which were trying since a long time, and probably the UK did not get that result. But probably also it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of mineral resources, especially in DRC, that Chinese companies are very much involved there, and maybe the US has there an incentive to regain some kind of say and of control on the evolution of this regional situation. But it shows that it's very risky for Europe not being able to invest in that part of the world as in other parts of the developing world and the global south. We have to be a very strong actor, otherwise we will be bypassed, we'll have no role. But to ensure that after such a diplomatic deal, for example, there is a little bit more alleviation of the suffering of the displaced people, of the people in need. But we should have a broader ambition. And so, yes, it's a good thing. Yes, we will have now to continue to support the population. This is a forgotten crisis for most of the people in the UK and in the EU, while it's one of the worst. Sudan, that Anneliese mentioned, and a lot of very good UK and European NGOs and the IRC are there. They need to be supported. They work with a lot of local Congolese NGOs, and we must also reinvest politically, diplomatically in this region. I just want to say that we have to recognize the need to do more evaluation, impact assessment of the way we are working. Maybe it's more necessary than to have more consultancy. And for example, together with Save the Children and other NGOs, we have been working with a tool called Dioptra. And even if IRC is only a small part of the global humanitarian sector, maybe 3% of it, it contributes to 25% of the impact evaluation of the humanitarian actions. And we are not doing this alone. Again, we are doing this with other colleagues of other INGO and local NGOs. But we should publish more this work. We should emphasize the fact that we are very much aware of the fact that we have to assess the best use of resources and to demonstrate that it works for the people.
Great, thank you. We've got 6 more questions, so I might ask you to speed up a little bit in your answers to that. And sorry, I didn't say thank you, Jean Roger, for the question on DRC. So the next 3, firstly from Mike Winter, maybe Anneliese, one for you. What impact is the use of the aid budget on covering the cost of UK-based asylum seekers having on current programmes overseas? Harlem, you've touched a bit on this next question, but from Vincent Iyenga, are regular important studies made on finding the most effective way of using aid? And then I'll take one on online. Charles, do you want to ask yours? And then I'll do yours, Liam, in the next round.
Yes, thanks very much. It's been a great talk so far. Just wanted to ask a question around prearranged financing for disasters. As a human species, we're really quite bad about this. We wait for disasters to happen and then fund the consequences. So the area of prearranged disaster financing, whether it's through disaster risk insurance or contingent credits, what's the UK FCDO view on this, and what's it doing to actually build and encourage this kind of new and exciting area?
Great. Thank you. Anneliese, do you want to pick up some of those?
Sure, and I will try and be much quicker about it. Thanks everyone for those really important questions. Mike, undoubtedly, there is a significant impact from the fact that so-called in-donor refugee costs, which is essentially costs related to the first year for refugees coming into the UK, the fact that those costs are counted as part of overseas development assistance, and thus contributing towards what is now going to become 0.3. Now, the UK is not alone in counting in-donor refugee costs as part of overseas development assistance, ODA. However, the proportion of that budget that's taken up by those costs is higher in the UK than in other countries. We all want it to come down. I certainly wanted it to come down as a minister. I know that the UK government wants it to come down. I think the challenge, being very frank with you, Mike, is actually, as we're trying to get those costs down, what happens to those costs if you just take them out of ODA? They would have to be paid for by the Home Office. Now, I think it's been very painful seeing those costs coming out of overseas development assistance. It would also be painful seeing those costs coming out of police numbers, for example, or prison places, or the other things that the Home Office currently spends funding on. So I don't think there's any silver bullet here, apart from the kind of work that Yvette is engaged in, ultimately trying to make sure that, you know, for example, we're reducing hotel use and really trying to pull that cost out of the system as quickly as possible. With the question from Mr. Yengar, yes, and I'm sure that Harlem will talk to that because IRC has done a lot of work around those issues of evaluation, but certainly it's the case from my experience as a former minister that there is that evaluation. I agree with Harlem that actually having more publicity around that and more transparency around it is really important, and more learning from what has gone really well with programs and what hasn't gone so well is important. And then finally, Charles's question, which was about prearranged finance, I think is a really important one. And actually, there have been some pretty good examples of this coming from the UK. I can't talk about FCDO's view on anything now. I'm a free agent. I'm afraid you'd need to speak to them directly or to current ministers. But certainly, when I was a serving minister, I was very aware that there were some good examples where the UK had sought to pre-position support. And now that can come in different ways. You can kind of provide cash transfers in advance of likely droughts, for example. I think the IRC actually has done some interesting work on that with trials of that. You can also make sure that support is pre-positioned in different locations when it looks likely that there will be a major problem. So we ensured that, for example, in Lebanon, when it appeared likely that there was going to be bombing there, that there was going to be displacement of population, and we made sure that there was pre-positioned aid there so that particularly children could be supported very quickly. We've also done that in relation to disaster response as well, with some small island states as the UK. So I do think it's really important, and it's something that is ultimately a huge amount cheaper than trying to respond after a disaster has already happened, because then it's so much harder to get the support in. You've got all the other problems associated with that. If you can have it pre-positioned and have it ready beforehand, it's much, much cheaper and more effective.
Hey, Harlem, over to you.
No, thanks, Alice. I don't have anything to add to what Anneliese just said. Thank you.
Oh, well done. Very, very good. Brilliant. And I've put a link in the chat. The Independent Commission for Aid Impact in the UK does a lot of really good reports, and they kind of report to the International Development Committee. We're also doing an inquiry at the moment on value for money at the FCDO on development, which will look at issues like consultancy. So that will be coming out soon. Okay, I'll go to the last 3 questions. Liam, do you want to do yours? Thank you for waiting patiently, and then I'll read out the 2 in the chat.
Hi, well, thank you both. Harlem, you mentioned the very real problem that aid's not going to the most needy in the world. And that being said, a really important criticism of the EU is that through the AMIF, aid goes to kind of strategic priorities around migration and doesn't really go to the most needy. And so my thought is that something that the UK should be really following the EU down this route? And if you allow me a second one, it's just to Anneliese. You also mentioned that trade's really important as part of development. Just if you had any thoughts about President von der Leyen's recent comments about setting up an alternative to WTO. I know we're all pro-Europeans here, but is abandonment of global multilateralism really a step forward for developing economies?
Great, thank you. And then Ian's question, if we're diverting aid to the defence budget, should we impose a windfall tax on companies profiting from increased defence spending? And then from Carl writes, agree UK-EU cooperation is essential, but OECD has just projected up to 18% decline in ODA, which will have an impact especially on Africa and on the least developed countries. That will affect not only bilateral aid, but also undermines global multilateral bodies. So Anneliese, in particular, could you respond to how the UK can not only restore ODA politically, but also regain diplomatic trust it's lost in international institutions like the UN? Harlem, can I go to you first, maybe particularly on kind of Liam's questions and that last one about the ODA on the EU?
Yes, Alice, but Liam, I did not understand very well what was the first part of your question on what the EU is doing and the UK should be doing or not. What was it?
I think if I can summarise quickly, I think it was more that the aid is not necessarily being targeted to the countries where the most poverty is, extreme poverty is, but it's being more aligned with strategic interests. Is that, there's truth in that? How do we kind of make sure that it's actually used for the right purpose? I think hopefully, Liam.
Yes, that's a big challenge, especially with the new, maybe you were referring to this new approach by the EU called Global Gateway strategy, which is a way to compete with the Western Belt, with the Silk Road strategy of China, and there are some risks there, because if you concentrate or you divert most of the development assistance towards that kind of strategy, de facto those are tools. I mean, I'm not against that global gateway approach, but it's more about investment linked to geopolitical approach in what are considered as very strategic developing countries in terms of future trade relationships or geopolitical influence or access to natural resources. But that kind of approach where you can bring private financing or World Bank financing and EU financing to develop some domain of activities, it's very good with emerging states, which are good partners for this, and where you have private company which consider that with some coverage they can take the risk to invest. But if you speak about Sudan today, or some part, most of Somalia, for example, which Anneliese mentioned, or the Sahel countries, global gateway which not help much, but the instability will remain in that part of the world, and the stakes are there for us in terms of conflict, in terms of supporting population, in terms of risk for migration. So I would say that, and that's why we have made that proposal at the IRC in the current discussion, which is ongoing in the EU about the future multi-year financial framework, because currently it's quite stable, but there will be a discussion about the next 7-year plan. And I think it will be also important for the UK to coordinate his approach with the EU about this. We think that they need to be two feet approaches, two legs approaches, I would say. And beside the global gateway strategy, there should be a fragile strategy, so that we are sure that we don't lose the need to have specific instruments which are much more adapted to the fragile context and to the local community support for those parts of the world for which this global getaway geopolitical approach will not be working. Thank you.
Thanks, Harlem. Anneliese, do you want to pick up some of the questions, the windfall tax one and the question about restoring the UK's leadership diplomatically in multilateral institutions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for those really key questions. I mean, Ian, I have to say I'm not an expert on the kind of projections around likely profits. I know that certainly John Healey will be seeking to ensure that there definitely is value for money for the taxpayer with the increase in defence spending. I'm sure that will be really key for him, and he's been trying to drive quite a lot of change, as I understand it, already within the Ministry of Defence around value for money. I think it's really important actually that investment results in good quality jobs as well, that it provides apprenticeships for people in areas also that are not as economically supported as others. So, you know, I do think there are many things that the government needs to be working on around that, and I'm sure that John will be looking at that really carefully. Indeed. In terms of the final question, I mean, I think undoubtedly, you know, of course, there has been criticism of the UK in relation to that reduction in overseas development assistance, as there has been criticism of other countries as well. As I said, it's quite, I felt it to be quite different depending on whether that reduction was kind of explicitly presented as ideological or otherwise. Nonetheless, of course, it has an impact. You know, as I was mentioning at the beginning, I think we really need to see reform of the multilateral system. Now, it's easier to argue for that when you're a bigger contributor rather than a smaller contributor. But that's where actually I think it's really important the UK does work with like-minded countries, like many of those in the EU, with the EU itself, and indeed with countries in the global south that have a similar perspective to us. So I think there is a lot that we can still do. I also think that the UK often is viewed as having an approach when it comes to technical issues, when it comes to, for example, legal or market-based issues, that is still valuable, that often relies on the fact that you have Brits, as I said, all around the world working on many of these matters, whether they're doing it for the government or not. They may be working for NGOs, for business, for multilateral institutions, but they do have that connection to our country, and I think that is still valuable.
And I realised there was just one last question, Liam, that you asked, maybe that Harlem could pick up, which was about the remarks from Ursula von der Leyen about setting up some kind of alternative to WTO. I don't know exactly. Don't quote me on those words because I don't know what she said exactly, but I think the gist was, is that helpful, or should we just focus on existing institutions and strengthening, reforming them?
Yes, I've seen this, but I'm not aware of the details, but I think probably what she means is that it's a little bit like in other field, like maybe ODA. I mean, if the US withdraw, it's a big problem, but it's a fact also that 50%, 60%, sometimes in trade, world exchanges, 80% of the rest of the world can continue to have agreement. And so we should not stop to look for multilateral settings just because one big actor, the biggest one, is withdrawing from existing agreement and is blocking machinery like the WTO. So I don't know exactly how it will work, but it's a fact that there are a lot of, as you know, bilateral agreement between the EU and other trade blocs, and also between the UK and the EU. And so we could imagine to rebuild some kind of international rules and cooperation and dispute settlement mechanism without the US. And we should not be stopped by the US policy to continue to develop cooperation with others. And I think it is the same probably when they are withdrawing from UN agencies. It has been the case when they withdraw from UNESCO, for example. So if we can keep the existing agency, it's better, because it's very difficult to rebuild something which will be better than existing UN agencies based on the UN Charter. But if it's not possible, we could imagine to rebuild some other kind of framework of cooperation. Thank you very much.
That's banged 8 o'clock. Can I say thank you to everyone for joining? Just to say there are about 50 of us, I think, new MPs alone that were nominated by the Labour Campaign for International Development. So there is a strong cohort of MPs who really care about these issues. I know there are more of us, and we are pushing on a number of areas, particularly this financing piece. And just one thing I was going to mention, slightly relates to that windfall tax, but is that there's 2.5 billion of money from the sale of Chelsea that is somewhere locked in an account that should be being used for people in Ukraine, and a lot of that, as I understand it, is to do with legal complications with Portugal and other countries. So it's an example, I think, of how we have to work really closely with partners to unlock funding. So thank you for joining us. Thank you especially to Anneliese and Harlem for really interesting remarks, and thank you to all of you for joining and for such great questions as well. So we'll end there, and there's still a bit of light outside. So thank you all very much for your time.